42 years. 42 years of my life handed over to a woman who, in one careless sentence at her retirement gala, told an entire ballroom exactly what she thought I was worth. She didn't say it to hurt me, I don't think. That's almost the worst part. She said it the way you'd mention the weather. Like it was simply true. And everyone already knew it, and there was no reason to lower her voice. I was standing off to the side in a rented tuxedo, a glass of sparkling water sweating in my hand, when her old colleague from the hospital board asked her, loud enough for the room to catch it, "And who's this handsome fella? Your driver for the night?" And my wife, Diane, laughed that bright, easy laugh she saves for people she wants to impress, and she said, "Oh, that's just Walter. He's my house manager. Keeps everything running, so I don't have to think about it." Anyone. House manager. 42 years, and I was her house manager. The room laughed with her. A soft ripple of amusement, champagne glasses tilting, someone patting my shoulder like it was a fine joke we were all in on together. And I did what I have always done in that family. I smiled. I raised my glass a little, like a good sport, like a man who didn't mind being the punchline at his own wife's retirement party. I even said something to smooth it over, something like, "Well, somebody has to keep the lights on around here." A weak, little laugh followed me the rest of the night, trailing me like a shadow I couldn't shake. But something in me, something that had been holding its breath for years, finally exhaled. Because that morning, before the gala, before the tuxedo, before the champagne, I had done something I never thought I'd have the nerve to do. I had sat alone at our kitchen table, in the pale gray light of 6 in the morning, and I had signed my name to a set of divorce papers. My own name. In my own hand. For the first time in over 4 decades, I had done something purely, entirely for myself. She had no idea. Not the faintest one. And that night, standing in that ballroom while people chuckled at the house manager, I carried that secret in my jacket pocket like a loaded weapon I hadn't decided yet whether I'd fire. Let me back up, though, because you need to understand what 42 years of quiet erasure actually looks like before I can tell you what happened at the top of that hotel ballroom. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist. I wasn't destined for anything glamorous, and I never wanted to be. I liked working with my hands. I became an electrician at 19, and by the time I was 25 I had my own small contracting business, doing wiring and repair work for half the houses in our county. I met Diane at a community fundraiser when she was 23, fresh out of nursing school, sharp as a blade and twice as fast-talking. She had this fire in her, this hunger to be somebody, and God help me, I loved her for it. I loved watching her mind work. I loved that she saw further than I did, wanted more than I did. I told myself that was a good thing in a marriage, that one of us should have big dreams, and I would be the one who made sure the ground under those dreams never shifted. When Diane got into a nurse practitioner program 2 years after we married, we sat at this same kitchen table, a different table then, but the same kind of morning light, and we made a decision together. I would step back from taking on new contracts. I'd keep just enough small jobs to bring in something, but mostly, I'd run the house. She'd finish her degree, and later, when the opportunity came, she'd go on for her doctorate in nursing leadership. It made sense. It was practical. We were a team, and my job on that team was to hold everything steady so she could climb. And I did. God, I did. I raised our daughter, Rosalind, and our son, Peter, nearly by myself for years while Diane worked double shifts and then, later, chased her doctorate at night after full clinical days. I was the one who packed the lunches with a note tucked inside. I was the one who sat up with Peter when he had night terrors, who drove Rosalind to dance recitals and swim meets, who learned to braid hair because there was nobody else in the house to do it most evenings. I was the one who kept the checkbook balanced, the roof patched, the furnace running, dinner on the table, at 6 even on the nights I knew she wouldn't make it home to eat it. I built us a good life with these 2 hands, the same hands people were calling a house manager's hands, like there was something lesser about them. I was proud of it. I want to be clear about that. I never once resented being the one at home. I thought it was noble work. I thought Diane knew that too. But somewhere in there I couldn't tell you the exact year, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way rust happens, slow and patient. The way she looked at me started to change. She climbed from nurse practitioner to department director to, eventually, chief nursing officer of the whole regional hospital system. And with every rung she climbed, I seemed to shrink a little further into the background of our own life. It started small. She'd come home from a 14-hour day and look at a kitchen where I had fed 2 children, cleaned up 3 meals, and refereed a homework crisis and sigh at a single dish in the sink like it was evidence of my laziness. If I tried to talk about something happening in my small business, a tricky rewiring job or a client who'd been slow to pay, her eyes would glaze, and she'd say something like, "Walter, I've had actual life and death decisions today," as if my day hadn't mattered at all. At dinners with her hospital colleagues, I'd start a sentence and watch her physically turn her body towards someone else mid-word, picking up a different conversation like I'd simply stopped talking. I began to believe, the way you believe things you're told often enough, that I genuinely didn't have much worth saying. I got quieter. I stopped offering opinions at those dinners. I became furniture with a pulse. I told myself she was under enormous pressure. I told myself this was simply what success did to a person, and that underneath it, she still saw me, still needed me, still loved the man who'd built the frame she was standing on. I told myself a lot of things to keep from looking too closely at what was actually happening in my own home. Then, 4 years ago, I found out about Dr. Marcus Ryland. I wasn't snooping. I want to say that plainly, because it matters to me even now. Diane's phone buzzed on the counter while she was upstairs showering, and the screen lit up with a message that read, "In full view, counting down the minutes till Chicago. Same room as last time? M.A." The name attached to it was a man I'd met twice at hospital functions, tall, silver-templed, the kind of confident that comes from never once being told no. Dr. Marcus Ryland, chief of surgery. The floor didn't just tilt, it fell away entirely. I stood there in our kitchen, holding a phone that wasn't mine, staring at a sentence that rearranged every year of my life behind me. When she came down in her robe, hair wet, humming something under her breath, I looked at her and felt something close to vertigo. I didn't confront her. I told myself I needed proof, needed to understand, needed to give her the benefit of a doubt I already knew somewhere in my gut she didn't deserve. "Rough day?" I asked her instead. "You have no idea," she said, and went to pour herself a glass of wine, and that was that. The Chicago trip happened the following week. A leadership conference, she called it. I drove her to the airport myself. I kissed her goodbye at the curb like a fool, like the house manager I apparently was, and I drove home and sat in our driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. It didn't stop there. Over the following years it became a quiet, grinding pattern conferences that ran suspiciously long. A second phone I found tucked in the lining of an old gym bag. Hotel charges on a card I wasn't supposed to know about. A perfume that wasn't the one I'd bought her for Christmas suddenly appearing on her collars. I became, without ever wanting the job, an investigator inside my own marriage. I cataloged evidence I never asked to collect. And still, for the longest time, I said nothing, because I kept thinking of Rosalind and Peter, grown now with their own families, and I didn't want to be the man who blew up their mother's life, even though their mother had already quietly blown up mine. What finally broke something loose in me wasn't even the affair. In the end, it was the money. I discovered it 11 months ago, going through old statements to refinance the house, a separate brokerage account opened 4 years back, funded slowly and steadily with transfers skimmed from our joint retirement savings. Money I had helped earn through decades of contracting jobs I took on the side. Money from the equity we'd built together in the house I had personally rewired, replumbed, and rebuilt half of with my own hands. She had been quietly moving our life savings into an account with only her name on it, preparing, I understood with a cold clarity, for a future that didn't include me, funded, in no small part, by me. That was the moment the love finally died in me. Not with a scream, not with tears. It died quietly, the way a pilot light goes out 1 second there, the next just gone, and a strange stillness left in its place. I didn't rage. I didn't confront her across the kitchen table. Instead, I did something I'm genuinely proud of. I got methodical. I was, after all, a man who spent his life reading blueprints and tracing wiring through walls nobody else wanted to bother with. I hired an attorney, a sharp, unassuming woman named Priya Anand who specialized in cases exactly like mine, and I quietly began building a case as carefully as I'd ever built anything. Bank records. The old phone with the messages, still sitting in a drawer where I'd hidden it, photographs of hotel receipts. A private investigator's report, unglamorous and thorough, covering 14 months of conferences. I had it all organized in a binder, the way I used to organize job estimates, tab by tab, line by line. I only needed the right moment. And then the invitation to her retirement gala arrived. 42 years of nursing leadership, capped off with a black tie celebration at the Farrington Grand downtown, 300 of her colleagues, board members, and, of course, Dr. Marcus Ryland, set to give a toast in her honor. I read the invitation twice, sitting alone at the kitchen table, and I understood, the way you sometimes just know a thing in your bones, that this was the moment. Not out of cruelty, out of a strange, quiet sense of justice. She wanted an audience for the crowning night of her career. Fine. She would have one. The morning of the gala, I woke early in the guest room, where I'd been sleeping for the better part of a year under the excuse of my back. The house was silent except for the low tick of the old furnace I'd installed myself 2 decades ago. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked, for a long moment, at the photograph magnet on the fridge. Diane and me at Rosalind's wedding, both of us laughing at something now lost to memory. I felt no anger looking at it, only a tired, aching sadness for the man in that photograph, a man who had given absolutely everything and never once stopped to ask if it was being given to someone who deserved it. I pulled the folded papers from the inside pocket of my old work jacket, still hanging by the door out of habit. I laid them on the kitchen table, the same kind of morning light as the day we'd decided together 40 years ago that I'd be the one to step back. I signed my name, printed it beneath, dated it. It took less than a minute and it ended more than 4 decades. We drove to the Farrington Grand separately. Same as always, she left early for photographs with the hospital board. I came later on my own, in a tuxedo I'd rented because I owned nothing that nice. I remember driving past the hospital's new East Wing, the one with her name on a small brass plaque in the lobby, and thinking about how much of that building, one way or another, I had quietly helped pay for with money, with time, with years of my life folded into hers so she could build something that would outlast us both. The ballroom at the Farrington Grand was on the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the whole glittering sweep of the city. Round tables draped in white, an ice sculpture shaped like the hospital's caduceus logo, more silver hair and expensive watches than I'd seen in one place in my life. I found a spot near the windows and watched Diane work the room the way she always had, luminous, commanding, laughing her big bright laugh. A hand always finding someone's arm. A woman, entirely. Gloriously in her element. Dr. Marcus Ryland stood near the head table in a tuxedo that fit him the way mine never quite fit me, watching her with an expression I recognized instantly, because I used to wear it myself 40 years ago, before it got worn down to nothing. That's when the board member made his little joke, and Diane called me her house manager, and the room laughed, and I laughed with them, and something in me finally, quietly, completely let go of the last thread it had been holding on to. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk I contributed almost nothing to. Then the toasts began. One after another, colleagues stood and praised Diane's brilliance, her tireless dedication. 42 years of service, of sacrifice, of building something extraordinary. Nobody mentioned who had been holding the house together while she built it. Nobody ever did. Then Dr. Marcus Ryland rose, tapped his glass, and the room quieted. "I've had the privilege," he said, smiling that easy surgeon's smile, "of working alongside Diane for going on 5 years now. And I can say, without exaggeration, she's the finest partner I've ever had." A ripple of warm laughter. At the word, partner. A knowing glance passed between 2 women at my table that I understood immediately and completely. He went on, something about her strength, her vision, how lucky the hospital was to have had her, and how lucky, he said, raising his glass toward her with just a beat too much meaning. Some people are to know a woman like that at all. I felt the eyes of the 2 women at my table flick toward me, curious, almost pitying, wondering if the house manager understood what he'd just heard. I understood perfectly. When the toasts finished, Diane made her way over, glowing, glass of champagne in hand, and pulled me by the elbow toward a cluster of board members. "Everyone," she said, that same bright public voice. "I have to introduce my husband, Walter, my house manager. As you heard, 42 years, and he still doesn't know how to work a dishwasher. Laughter again, warm and easy. The kind of laughter that costs the room nothing and costs me everything. I looked at her. I looked at the board members waiting for me to deliver my usual self-deprecating line, the good sport routine I'd performed 1,000 times. I felt the weight of the papers in my jacket pocket, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath along with me. "House manager," I said slowly, letting the words sit in the air the way you let a joint settle before you trust it to hold weight. "That's an interesting way to put it." Diane's smile flickered, just slightly, the way a bulb does right before it goes. "Because," I continued, reaching into my jacket, "this morning, before I put on this tuxedo, I signed the papers to end our marriage. I drew them out, held them up, let the Farrington Grand's chandelier light catch the letterhead of Priya Anand's firm. And I think, before the night's over, you and Dr. Ryland here might want to sit down together, because my attorney will be filing a full financial disclosure. It covers a certain brokerage account you opened 4 years ago, and it covers a fair amount of what's been happening on your leadership conferences since then, too." The silence that followed was absolute. I have never, in 63 years of living, heard a room go that quiet that fast. 300 people, and you could hear the ice sculpture dripping. Diane's face didn't just go pale, it went the color of the tablecloths. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. This woman who commanded boardrooms and code teams and life-or-death decisions every single day of her working life, and in that moment she had absolutely nothing. Marcus Ryland's easy surgeon smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the particular panic of a man doing rapid math about his own marriage, his own career, his own name on a hospital donor wall. I didn't wait for either of them to recover. I turned to the table, to the board members still frozen mid-sip, and said, as steadily as I could manage, "Enjoy the rest of the evening, everyone. Congratulations, Diane. Truly." Then I put the papers back in my pocket, and I walked out of that ballroom a free man for the first time in 42 years. I didn't look back once. I didn't need to. I could feel 300 sets of eyes on my back, and for once in my life, I didn't feel small under them. I felt, for the first time I could remember, entirely my own size. The elevator ride down 31 floors was the most peaceful few minutes of my adult life. I watched the numbers count down and I laughed, once, quietly, alone, the sound bouncing off brushed steel walls. I thought about all the years I had spent making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger, and I let that thought go, floor by floor, until it was gone by the time the doors opened onto the lobby. I went home to a house that suddenly felt like it belonged entirely to me because, as it turned out later, it legally would. I called Priya from the driveway. "It's done," I told her. "I served her tonight, in front of everyone." There was a pause on the line, and then she said, quietly, "Good. Good for you, Walter." The weeks that followed were, as I expected, a storm. Diane called 40, 50 times. I let most of them go to voicemail, though I listened to a few, because in a strange way it was good medicine. "Walter, how could you humiliate me like that, in front of my entire career?" she demanded in one, her voice cracking with a fury I'd never once heard directed at anyone but me. In another, quieter, wheedling, the voice she used to close hospital contracts. "Walter, please, we can fix this. Think about the kids. Think about 42 years. 42 years. As though the number itself was an argument, as though longevity excused everything that had filled it. The kids were not, as it turned out, on her side the way she'd hoped. Peter called me the morning after the gala, his voice tight. "Dad, half the hospital staff has already texted Rosalind. Is it true? The account? Ryland?" I told him the truth, plainly, because he deserved that much after a lifetime of watching me smooth things over. "It's true, son. All of it." There was a long silence, and then he said, "I'm coming this weekend to help you move your workshop stuff out of the garage. You're going to need the space." And both my children came that weekend. They didn't abandon their mother. They're better people than that, better than I sometimes managed to be, but they knew exactly where the truth lived. And they stood in my driveway helping me carry boxes of tools out to a small rental house I'd found nearby. Tools I hadn't touched seriously in years. The tools of the man I used to be before I folded myself down to fit inside someone else's life. The divorce proceedings were, true to form, ugly and swift. Diane's hospital board, mortified by the publicity because of course it got out. A story like that always does quietly pressured her toward an early retirement package rather than let the details reach the local news. Ryland's marriage did not survive the winter. I walked away from the settlement with the house, my old truck, and a portion of savings that, for once in my life, felt less like money and more like proof that everything I'd given had actually counted for something, even if it took 42 years and one ballroom full of strangers for anyone to say so out loud. But the real victory wasn't the settlement. It was quieter than that, and it lived somewhere behind my sternum where the tightness used to be. Diane went from the most respected nursing executive in the state to a cautionary tale murmured about at hospital fundraisers. I didn't do that to her. Not really. End quote. I just stopped protecting her from the truth of what she'd already done. I reopened my little electrical contracting business 6 months after the gala, in a small shop 2 towns over, and I went back to it the way you go back to an old friend, awkward at first. Then like no time had passed at all. I started taking on apprentices, showing younger guys how to read a panel, how to trace a fault through old plaster walls without tearing the whole house apart. I felt useful again in a way I hadn't in years. I felt, strange as it sounds, like a young man again, even with gray in my beard and 42 years behind me. And there was someone new, eventually, though I want to be honest, and say I wasn't looking for her. Her name is Carol Pacus. She runs the hardware store I'd bought supplies from for 30 years, a widow with an easy laugh and absolutely no interest in whether I could work a dishwasher. She never once made me feel like the help. She asked about my work like it actually mattered to her, and one Tuesday over coffee at her counter, I realized I was smiling in a way I hadn't in longer than I could remember, and it had nothing to do with performing for anyone. 8 months after the gala, I received a letter from Diane, the last one I ever got. Not an apology, a justification, mostly blaming pressure, blaming me for never understanding her world, blaming everyone but the woman who'd opened a secret account and booked a hotel room in Chicago. I read it once, standing at my own kitchen counter in my own small house, and felt nothing sharp at all. Just a quiet, settled stillness, like a house finally wired correctly after years of faulty connections. I didn't write back, end quote. There was nothing left to say to a stranger wearing a familiar face. These days I wake up early in my little house on Cypress Lane, make coffee the way I like it, strong and simple, and sit on the back step and watch the light come up over the fence line. I'm not a wealthy man by anyone's accounting. I'm not the man whose name is on a brass plaque in a hospital lobby. But I am, for the first time since I was a young man in love with a girl full of fire, entirely and completely myself. So here's what I'd say to you, whoever's listening, however you found your way to this story. I learned the hardest way a man can learn anything, that love isn't supposed to cost you your own name. Supporting someone, sacrificing for someone, holding a family together with your own 2 hands, none of that makes you smaller. None of it makes you the help. If you find yourself disappearing inside somebody else's success, if you find the people who are supposed to love you treating your sacrifice like it was simply owed to them, you are not required to stay invisible to keep the peace. You are allowed to take up space in your own life again. You are allowed to be the man or woman standing in the center of your own story, not the one quietly holding the ladder while somebody else climbs. And sometimes, the loudest thing you can ever say to someone who's spent years making you small is not a shout across a crowded room. It's a quiet, steady voice, a folded piece of paper, and a door closing gently behind you as you walk out toward whatever life is actually waiting for you, once you finally decide you're worth walking toward it.